Thanks, Aaron. And hope everybody can hear me okay. And thank you all for your time in attending this evening's meeting. So maybe I'll start with a quick description of Dundas Street, which most of you likely use on a daily basis. From end to end, the Dundas Street corridor is about 19.5 kilometers long, stretching from Mississauga's border with Oakville in the west to the City of Toronto's Kipling Station in the east. Dundas Street connects many parts of the city and acts as a key transit spine that links people with where they live, work, learn, and play. As the city continues to grow, a big portion of that growth is expected to occur along Dundas Street. And because of this, along with a future bus rapid transit line, the city began a review of lands on both sides of the corridor through the Dundas Connects Master Plan project. Next slide, please. As part of that project, we used several key principles to come up with the vision for the corridor, taking into account potential opportunities and existing constraints. The vision's primary focus is to see Dundas Street develop into an urban corridor served by rapid transit that is walkable, bikeable, accessible, and affordable. With population and employment growth in targeted areas along the corridor, and with access to public spaces and community facilities that support a high quality of life for residents. As part of the Dundas Connects project, we made sure that we engage directly with our key audiences. That includes departments across the City of Mississauga, city councillors, neighboring municipalities, the province, Metrolinx, conservation authorities, and other interest groups. We held more than 60 face-to-face events and made more than 3,000 contacts with interested people. Next slide. Coming out of the Dundas Connects project, key recommendations were developed that focus on future growth, generally concentrated at 7 focus areas. These focus areas surround major intersections along Dundas, and they're shown as circles on the slide. The recommendations take into consideration the future Dundas bus rapid transit line and provide direction for development to support this new transit line through land uses and built form. Some of these key master plan directions include maintaining 4 lanes for traffic along Dundas Street, enhancing the non-car experience by encouraging street-related retail, improving safe cycling access, increasing pedestrian space, and providing street trees along the length of the corridor. It also provides direction on encouraging mixed-use development that supports the future transit line while creating more open spaces and community facilities. Next slide, please. The Dundas Connects Master Plan and its recommendations were endorsed by Council in 2018. Since then, city staff have been taking on a number of projects to implement some of the recommendations of that master plan. A list of these projects are listed on the slide on your screen. As you can see, some projects were recently completed. For example, policies to safeguard the Dundas right-of-way were approved in early 2020. Another example is the completion of a land use compatibility terms of reference, which provides guidance for proposed land uses or sensitive land uses in employment areas along Dundas. Other projects are still ongoing with their own public engagements, such as the citywide major transit station area project, the downtown Cooksville, Fairview, and Hospital Review, and a number of other flood studies. Each project looks at implementing different components of the endorsed master plan recommendations. Next slide, please. So following council direction in 2021, staff began preparing draft policies to modify the Mississauga official plan. Now, the Mississauga official plan is the primary guiding document for planning matters within the city. These draft policies are intended to implement some of the land use and urban design recommendations of the master plan through the Dundas Corridor Policy Implementation project, which is the subject of tonight's meeting. Next slide. The proposed changes to the city's official plan would affect a number of current neighborhood and employment area policies along the corridor. These policies include changes to specific land uses, provide height and build form requirements, as well as require the expansion of the parks and road networks to accommodate future growth along the corridor. Next slide. The draft policies cover everything from the vision and guiding principles for growth along Dundas to community facilities, urban form, transportation, land uses, heights, and densities. For the purposes of engagement, all the policies are presented together. However, some of these policies, especially those linked to land uses, heights, and densities, they're expected to be implemented as part of the city's major transit station area project. I'll now briefly just talk about some of these key policies being proposed. Next slide. So among the proposed changes to the official plan, the Dixie-Dundas community node will now be defined with a boundary. It's currently shown conceptually in the official plan as a circle. Essentially, community nodes are focal areas within the city that provide a range of day-to-day services and opportunities to meet the needs of surrounding residents and workers. For the Dixie-Dundas node, proposed policies would include those related to land uses and heights. It's important to note that development for some areas within the node are restricted by flooding. You can see some of these areas on your screen defined in the hatched area. There are currently ongoing flood studies that are looking at revising the floodplain boundaries, but they will need to be completed along with any mitigation measures before development can proceed within the node. Once these flood issues are resolved, the node will be able to accommodate additional growth and development opportunities. Next slide. Another key set of proposed policies are those related to land uses that provide additional opportunities for introducing a balanced mix of residential employment development in a range of building types. Not all areas along the corridor are expected to grow in the same way, but some areas will have conditions that would enable more growth than others. Having a mix of land uses will better support complete communities and would include a range of office, medium to high density residential, retail, and commercial uses that provide active frontages along Dundas Street. Recommended additional permissions for mixed-use areas within employment areas will require consideration for land use compatibility. The land use compatibility requirements are outlined by a terms of reference that was recently developed by the city and available to the public. Sensitive land uses will not be permitted automatically, but will be based on criteria and studies to determine if additional new uses would be appropriate in certain areas. Next slide, please. The draft policies would also look to implementing a range of appropriate heights along the corridor, depending on the location. These policies would generally include changing height permissions to permit up to 6 stories along the corridor as a whole, up to 12 stories in select areas around key intersections such as Winston Churchill, Erindale Station, Cawthra, Dixie, and Wharton, and up to 25 stories near the Cooksville and Dixie GO stations. Next slide. Policies would also address key urban design requirements related to setbacks and building design. The intent is to have a build form that generally encourages higher densities along Dundas and major intersections with active retail street frontage, while transitioning to lower heights closer to surrounding lower density areas. What you see on the slide is just an example of what that might look like. However, much like heights, specific policies related to build form will vary depending on the location along the corridor. Next slide. As new development occurs along the Dundas Street corridor, additional parks and open spaces will be required to serve the new residents. These parks and open spaces will vary in their form depending on local needs, but will take into account factors such as being centrally located, emphasizing key view corridors, and improving connections and accessibility in their design. The exact location, size, and requirements will be determined in coordination with city staff. Next slide. The policies would also or will also encourage a finer grain of blocks to improve both non-vehicular and vehicular permeability between the Dundas corridor and the nearby communities. This will provide more accessibility, particularly to transit, and multimodal opportunities. The expansion of the road network will be proposed conceptually in the draft policies, and the intent is that the exact location and design will be determined as development occurs over time. Next slide, please. In terms of next steps, staff have organized this meeting to get initial public input on the overall approach for implementing the recommendations of the Dundas Connects Master Plan. We intend to post the draft policies on the project website fairly soon. Staff will work towards refining the draft policies to present them officially through a statutory public meeting, likely in May. Based on the input received, staff will target this summer to present a report with the policies for approval. Policies linked to the major transit station areas, specifically those for heights, land uses, and densities, will be implemented through a separate official plan amendment. So as Aaron mentioned, we'll be looking specifically at areas affected by flooding, primarily east of Huron-Ontario, and then we'll look at some of the policies that we're considering for some of the mixed-use areas along Dundas. So our first focus for this portion of the presentation is on the lands affected by flooding along Dundas. Currently, there are areas east of Huron-Ontario that have been historically affected by flooding issues. As a result, there are 3 concurrent flood-related studies underway to address these issues. The first is the Little Etobicoke Creek Flood Evaluation Study, which looks at flood mitigation options for the entire Little Etobicoke Creek watershed area. And it might be difficult to see, but it's shown in green. It's quite a large area extending from Courtney Park in the north to Queensway East in the south. The second study is the Dixie Dundas Flood Mitigation Study, which looks at flood mitigation options at a more localized scale, specifically for the neighborhoods around Dundas Street and Dixie Road. And then we also have the Etobicoke Creek Preliminary Flood Mitigation Study, which examines flood mitigation for the neighborhoods around Dundas Street and Etobicoke Creek near the Toronto border east of the city. Next slide, please. In addition to the ongoing flood studies, the city's official plan currently includes 3 special policy areas, or SPAs, which significantly restrict development due to potential storm flooding. They're defined by a provincial government criteria and established by the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. The current SPA boundaries do not reflect recent flood events, and so an update is required to reflect the new extents of the flooding. This is something the city is addressing through the Special Policy Area Review Project. Results from the other flood studies mentioned earlier will be used to refine the SPA boundaries, and this will require provincial and conservation authority approval. Next slide, please. So although the proposed policies will include land use designations and height requirements for flood-affected areas, development in those areas cannot be fully implemented without first addressing the flood issues, and in some cases, updating the special policy area boundaries if needed. The slide you see summarizes the policy requirements needed before potential development opportunities for the affected areas are possible. This includes large areas within the new Dixie Dundas community node and areas close to the Etobicoke Creek east of the city. Next slide, please. Another key proposed policy change that we would like to highlight in this portion of the presentation is the potential introduction of sensitive land uses for mixed-use areas along Dundas Street that currently do not permit such uses. Areas already designated as mixed use within the Dixie, Mavis Arundel, and Western Business Park employment areas shown in blue on the slide may be allowed to have additional land uses subject to criteria and a city-initiated official plan amendment. The existing employment uses along the corridor are regionally significant, and so the continued viability of these uses is an important consideration. Balancing employment viability and the vision for a true mixed-use development along Dundas Street would be determined by appropriate studies such as land use compatibility. This would be done at the development review stage for only the lands identified in the Dundas Connects master plan, and they're shown as the hashed area on the slide. I know it's tiny, but we can zoom in probably to show it clearer. And they would be assessed on a case-by-case basis as well. Next slide, please. So in order to ensure that land use compatibility is appropriately assessed, a standard terms of reference was developed by the city. This is intended to provide a level of clarity on the requirements to determine whether additional land uses are suitable. On the slide, you will see a high-level summary of how the terms of reference would be applied. So essentially, you would identify the context, depending on the location of the site, and then identifying the class types of the surrounding employment areas. Then you would determine areas of influence based on the class type and take into account employment area future operations if they are available. Based on that, you would carry out the required studies, which may include noise, air, odor, and vibration. The TOR, or the Terms of Reference, will not be an official plan policy, but rather a guiding document that will assist in scoping and preparing appropriate studies to address land use compatibility. These studies would be peer-reviewed and would only apply to specific lands designated as mixed use. If additional land uses are not considered appropriate, the lands will continue to function as mixed-use designated lands subject to the policies of the employment area. However, if additional uses are considered appropriate, the affected sites would be removed from the employment area through an amendment to the official plan initiated by the city.
For those of you who did open up the QR code or who did check on the links, you can see that on the project webpage, there's actually a registration sign-in page. And if you haven't already, we do ask that you sign up for that. I know that a few of you on this call anyway have signed up for our project updates, and so you to sort of understand how this works. But it's really truly the best way to stay up to date on what's happening with this project. And you will get updates for upcoming public meetings and statutory and public meetings. There's also just a lot of good information on these websites if you want to dig into this a little bit more and kind of understand how all these pieces are fitting together. And the same goes for the major transit station area. That study as well has a lot of good links to it. Again, as I mentioned, to the region's website. So you can start to see, it's like a layer cake. You can start to see how all these layers start to fit together and what this looks like from a city building perspective. The project contact for both of these is Bashar. So as you've met him tonight, that would be who you would be emailing if you have additional questions. And if anything does pop up after this meeting or, like in the next coming weeks, feel free to just send us either a message through any of the project websites, or you can contact Bashar and we'll get that information posted. And we usually post our questions on the FAQ page on either of these. And so we'll just move on to the next page, Brendan. So what we've got right here really, again, is the project information for the Dundas BRT and the flood study mitigation. So again, Matthew, who you just heard from, he's project contact there. And if you've got any questions related to that, I'd ask you to direct the questions there. And the same with the Dixie Dundas flood mitigation study. Anthony would be your primary contact for that. To let you know, we have been taking notes this evening. So we know that your comments will be recorded, and what we do is we pass those on to the project leads so they can consider them as we start to refine the policies for the engagement. So I do hope you know that we do appreciate you coming out, saying what you have to say. It does mean something to us at the city, and we want to make sure that we've got multiple ways of capturing what you've had to say. So we've recorded the video tonight, and an edited version of this will be available on the website in the coming weeks. I'll put the presentations up as well. So if you want to share those with anyone who wasn't available, who wasn't able to make it tonight, that information will be available too. And again, I'm going to pause for a second to make sure that we're good. There's no questions that you don't have. You're feeling clear about what's happening on Dundas right now. And if you want, you can just raise your hand. But it sounds like we're good, folks. So with that, I'm going to go to the final slide. And I'm going to thank you all for attending tonight. I'm going to thank the counselors again. Thank you, Councillor Mullen, Councillor Dasco, and Councillor Fonseca for joining us tonight. It's really lovely to have you here. We appreciate all the city staff who also was in the background troubleshooting the best they could, as well as addressing questions that was really in their scope of expertise. So we appreciate you all for coming out tonight. Again, as I said, we'll have this posted on the project website in the coming weeks, so please stay tuned. We appreciate everything that you've done coming out here tonight, helping us run this meeting, and we hope that you have a great rest of your evening. So I'm going to close the meeting shortly, and you can have a great rest of your evening. Enjoy, folks, and thanks again for coming.